Good afternoon and thank you for joining us at Quays TV News. I'm Sophie Whitfield. Joining me in the studio today is Professor Mike Kagioglou. Thank you for coming in today. So,
Pleasure.
Why would you say there is so much focus on disaster risk in cities and urban environments?
Well, disaster is something that has been happening over time and for many years and centuries, and there have been some serious events over the last few millennia that wiped out civilizations, that have created a lot of upheaval in many communities. The difference these days is some of those disasters relate to the climate change, and so some of those are man-made disasters. And also, what makes it even more acute is the urbanization that takes place globally. So at the moment, there's something like 60% of all population living in cities, which means that even small disasters, so it's not necessarily the tsunamis or the huge earthquakes, but there might be small disasters that happen within cities. The accumulating effect of that is the equivalent of a big disaster. So you have the same amount of people possibly dying from some of those small disasters as they do from the big disasters. So in many ways, as the population growth increases, then you have a greater loss of life and also huge cost in many economies. In fact, today in the conference that we're running over here, one of the speakers identified that a lot of the developing countries, in fact, they go into deficit immediately after a huge disaster that happens in a country. So it's something that we need to take very seriously.
What are the major drivers of risk in urban environments, would you say?
There's quite a few of them. I think it's the availability of services, so that is the kind of infrastructure, the civil infrastructure of every city. And that can be and relate to police, fire, water, electricity, all your kind of main utilities. Obviously, earthquakes are critical components that contribute to disasters, and some areas are more prone to that than others. There are issues of civil unrest that can cause some of those circumstances. There's issues of inequality and how that manifests itself within communities. So it's a variety of issues. There isn't one or two, but there's a plethora of them that within a particular context they become more acute, and in different circumstances they can be quite catastrophic.
If we don't tackle these risks now, though, what does the future look like for people living in cities?
It looks very bleak. You will see, I mean, you've seen what happened in New Orleans, for example. Even 10, 15 years after that disaster, there are still something like 30% of the population has been displaced. 50% of the population that was displaced never returned back. So you're looking at some thriving communities that, in fact, they've disappeared off the map. And if you look at the inequalities that exist within cities, the impact of those disasters is disproportionate. Also, the cost of those disasters is rising every single year. So to give you an example, I think by 2030 we estimate that the population on Earth will be 9 billion. If you think that only about 20, 30 years ago it was about 6 billion, 6 billion, I think the rate of growth at the moment is 180,000 people per day. The increase. So considering just that, you can see that the impact on people actually multiplies.
What role would you say higher education will have on tackling the disaster risk?
It has a critical role to play. I think, as with every item, research is critical. And research is there, I think, to find solutions to problems, to identify the problems in the first place, to conceptualize about some of those solutions and issues. So, for example, I think disaster resilience and disaster response used to focus primarily on the kind of technical aspects of how do you deal immediately after a disaster, what do you need to put in place, the infrastructure that you need to put in place. Very quickly, I think there was a realization there's a governance issue of how you release finance, how you engage with the community to deal with some of those issues. Then the major issue now is how do you deal with those in 10 and 15 years' time? How do you deal with those communities? So the issues change all the time. It's not that we can find one solution now or answer one question now. The question keeps on changing as the circumstances change. So higher education has a key role in looking at what those issues are, in identifying some solutions. But I think also there's a different role for universities these days. It's not just about doing research behind closed doors and coming up with beautiful frameworks. It's about taking action. It's about contributing to policy development. It's about intervening in some of the circumstances and taking action and seeing the effects of that. So we contribute as higher education, we contribute in the learning part that is taking place as part of those things. So one of the aspects is around the research. The other is about building capacity. So, for example, again, the last 3 days in the conference, it was the second doctoral school for disaster resilience people, and we had individuals from 26 countries from all over the globe coming and dealing with some of those issues as part of their PhD studies. Those will be the future leaders in dealing with some of those issues. So I think we have a responsibility of nurturing that.
Now, specifically at your university, what are you doing to contribute to this disaster resilience globally and locally?
Well, very recently we invested heavily in establishing the Huddersfield Centre for Disaster Resilience. And as a result of that investment, now we have 2 world-leading professors that are leading the centre. We have a number of PhD students that are working with them. Within my school in particular, the art, design and architecture, we have a unique opportunity of looking at some of the disciplinary collaborations that can take place. So the role of art in community engagement, for example, the role of and issues around fashion and textiles in relation to disaster resilience. And in trying to bring all of those things together is what we're going to try and do in the future. But we started with some investment this year, and we aim to increase that as we go through the years.
Great. Thank you very much for coming in today, Professor.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Is that okay?